Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 1, an historicist commentary on the Revelation, updated and revised for the 21st century, derived from the original work of E.B. Elliott. Read by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur. Part 1, Chapter 3, The Third Seal. And when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, Come. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had in his hand a pair of balances. And I heard as it were a voice in the midst of the living creatures, saying, A koinix of wheat for a denarius, and 3 koinixes of barley for a denarius. And see thou hurt not, or rather, that thou wrong not in regard to the oil and the wine. The intent of the figuration in this seal is less obvious than in the former two, and will require some considerable thought and attention, though the change of the horse's color to black can scarce be mistaken as indicating generally the change to a state of aggravated distress and mourning. Let us therefore first consider the usually received, but as will appear, incorrect solution. Then, second, apply ourselves to seek one more correct and satisfactorily. Roman numeral 1. A famine of the chief articles of food, whether literally taken or metaphorically, has been supposed by nearly all interpreters to be implied in the other details of the poetic passage, as the cause of the distress indicated, their opinion being grounded on these two suppositions. First, that the koinix spoken of was the common Attic koinix. Second, that the specified prices for such a measure of wheat and of barley were famine prices. Nor, as to the first of these suppositions, do I contest its reasonableness. For although, not to dwell on the fact that the word koinix is sometimes used to designate measure in general, which generic sense, however, from the specification of a price given, is here of course quite out of the question, though I say without doubt that there were used in the Roman Empire koinixes of various specific values, vis-a-vis of 3, 6, and 8, as well as of 4 koitalae, or half pints, respectively. Yet was the Attic koinix of 4 koitalae, or 1 quart, so much the most common that, without direct countervailing evidence, we seem bound to take it as the one intended. But then, admitting the Attic koinix to be the one meant in the prefiguration, how far would the second supposition referred to be borne out, vis-a-vis, that the prices of a koinix of wheat and barley, named as from the throne, were famine prices? Of course, the average price, near or about the time of Domitian in St. John's exile in Patmos, must be the standard of reference. And judging by what the elder Pliny reports of prices a short time before, we shall find that though the price of wheat here named might be one of scarcity, it could hardly be called one of famine. Then, moreover, what of the very singularly added specification of the price of barley, 3 koinixes of barley for a denarius? Surely this is one such as to put the idea of famine altogether out of the question. For, to state the argument in its simplest form, forasmuch the Attic koinix was proverbially the day's sufficient quota for a man of wheat or barley, and at the same time a denarius was approximately the daily wages of labor in St. John's time, the price specified would indicate that a laboring man would gain under this seal nearly a 3 days' sufficiency of barley bread, above 5 pounds in weight, by 1 day's labor. Did ever one hear of such a famine as this? Thus, even were no other difficulty to oppose it, yet would the famine hypothesis break down utterly on this one single account. But in fact, Besides this, all else in the figuration, except indeed the black color of the horse, is opposed to it. Number 1. The injunction of the rider. See that thou injure not, or that thou act not unjustly about the oil and the wine. Those two other next most important articles of culture and consumption in the Roman world. An injunction of which the spirit was directly opposed to the idea of its being the main object in the voice from the throne to enjoin or to proclaim a famine. Number 2. The circumstance of its being a conjunctive, not disjunctive, which connects this latter clause of the charge to the rider about the oil and the wine with that charge in the former about the wheat and the barley, constitutes of itself a strong argument in favor of the former being of similar significance with the latter. Number 3. Moreover, the balance in the rider's hand, associated as it is, not with a man's weighing out bits of bread in scanty measure for his own or his family's eating, as in the often misapplied passage from Ezekiel 4:10 and 16, but in association with the buying and selling of corn. I say in this association, the balance, instead of being an indication of famine, might just as well be an indication of plenty, seeing that at all times corn and bread were sold by weight or measure. In fact, in the Roman Baker monument outside the Porta Maggiore at Rome, among the various implements of his trade there sculptured, a pair of balances is one. Was this, then, altogether a fit symbol for famine? Surely a more unfit one could scarce have been devised. Roman numeral 2. The idea of famine thus decisively set aside, we are forced to seek for some other and quite different solution, such as may better suit the conditions of the case. And in order to this, and with reference to two very important particulars in those conditions, it needs that we now conclude. First, as to the right construction of that latter clause in the voice as from the throne, whether in the sense of injure not or wrong not in regard to the oil and the wine. Second, in reference to the balance depicted as in the hand of the rider, what might have been its most usual meaning as a symbol at the time of the vision. Number 1. Now as to the Greek clause, the admissibility of the latter translation suggested, as well as the former, results clearly and necessarily, as it seems to me, from these two undisputed and indisputable facts. 1. That it is a neutral intransitive verb, as well as a verb transitive and active. The other, that in the case of intransitive neutral verbs generally, there is frequently appended to them an accusative of definition, i.e., one defining the object to which the verb relates, in which case, let me add, the accusative usually precedes the verb, so as here I subjoin a few illustrations below. The admissibility of the second rendering of the Greek, thus settled, a decisive reason at once suggests itself for preferring it, in order to any consistent sense of the rendering, injure not. The articles specified must needs be articles susceptible of injury, from some such famine-causing agency as that which the advocates of this translation recognize in the writer. But just what are the articles here specified? Not, be it well observed, vines and olives, on which the destroyer was often let loose by an angry providence, with his weapons of blight or hail, but instead the juice of the grapes and olive berries, oil and wine, when housed and secured by the owner in his casks and cellars. The only answer that I have seen made is that we are to suppose the oil and wine to be put here poetically and figuratively for the olives and vines. That is, we are to suppose poetry and figure intruded in noting them into the latter clause of a sentence, of which the former, when noting other fruits of the earth, is confessedly literal and prosaic. For we read not there in poetical phrase of waving cornfields, but simply of wheat and barley, and this in the state evidently of grain threshed out and ready for measuring out and sale. Number 2. Further, as regards that other and equally important point of indication in the symbol, the balance in the hand of the black horse's rider. Let it be well understood by the reader that this symbol, instead of being in itself any way mysterious or difficult of comprehension, was in fact one most common and obvious at the time of St. John's exile in Patmos, and always, I believe, in one way or another, a symbolization of justice. And now then, our analysis of the several parts of the symbol being completed, we proceed in search of a solution such as may satisfy them all. Whose or what is the agency, we have to ask, in the Roman Empire that was symbolized by the balance holding rider? Whose or what the voice admonishing him as from the throne, and wherefore in such terms about the price of corn and against injustice in the matter of wine and oil? How, though holding the balance of justice, his influence such in aggravation of the other previous evil as to deepen the sanguine red of the Roman aspect into the darker blackness of distress? Finally, what is the main intent of the hieroglyphic as a whole? And how does it designate some notable cause of further suffering and decline introduced into the Roman body politic, of suffering introduced at a time following that of the establishment of military misrule, with its concomitants of civil war and bloodshed, so as under the second seal, and preceding that of pestilence and mortality which, we shall soon see, attached to the fourth? This, I say, is the question, and though to ourselves for the present it be obscure and enigmatic, from want of that familiarity with Roman symbols and usages, which probably will have made the figuration at once clear to the evangelist, as a contemporary, yet on looking for light into history, and especially into that same philosophic and picturesque history of the Roman Empire, which has already so admirably illustrated the subjects of our first and second seals, the clue, if I mistake not, will be found, and the solution will appear. On consulting Gibbon, then we find, toward the close of his sketch of the reign of Alexander Severus, referring to the aggravated oppressiveness of taxation, consequent on a memorable edict of the preceding Emperor Caracalla, an edict which had to be enforced by the provincial governors, as a new and wasting evil then introduced into the body politic. It is after a retrospective glance at that primary cause of the empire's decline, which I suppose to have been pictured in the symbolization of the second seal, I mean the pure military despotism of the soldiery and the sword, that he takes it up for notice, even as if another influential cause of the decline of the empire. He deems it of importance such as to call for a long digression on the subject of Roman taxation to which it relates. Let me briefly abstract his statement. In the original constitution, then by the Roman Republic of its conquered provinces, it seems that tributes more or less onerous were imposed on them, which tributes, after the conquests of Greece and Syria, had become so productive as to suffice to pay all expenses of the government, and to allow the entire exemption of Roman citizens from all taxes. This exemption, however, continued only until the time of Augustus, who, soon after his establishment in the empire, declared the necessity of their again bearing a share also of the public burdens. Thus, from that time forward, the provincials had their distinctive taxes to pay, and also the Roman citizen theirs, the latter consisting of custom, duties, and excise, and the tax of 1/20th on legacies and inheritances, the former either of tribute or of produce in kind, or a money capitation tax. During the era of Trajan and Antonini, Gibbon says, the mildness and precision of the laws ascertaining the rule and measure of taxation, and protecting the subjects of every rank against arbitrary interpretations, antiquated claims, and the insolent vexations of the farmers of the revenue, alleviated the burdens, though they did not remove them. But some 30 or 40 years after the death of the last Antonini, while the rider of the red horse of civil war was yet in full career, they received, insofar as the provincials were concerned, a sudden aggravation. The Emperor Caracalla issued the memorable edict with which his name is associated, by which the Roman city was made coextensive with the empire. An edict not of liberality, as might at first have been imagined, but simply of avarice, for it was clogged with the condition that the provincials, thus admitted to Roman citizenship, should thenceforward pay both their provincial tributes as before, and also, in addition, the distinctive taxes of the Roman citizen. The edict was compulsory, and the weight of taxation thus forced upon them intolerable. Not even Italy escaped from the tyrant's financial oppression, though under another form. The great body of his subjects, says Gibbon, was oppressed by the aggravated taxes, and every part of the empire crushed under the weight of Caracalla's iron scepter. Nor did the evil of fiscal oppression, thus and then aggravated, end with him. It was continued onward substantially, as I must observe, an inward canker in the state. Macrinus, whose brief reign for but a year succeeded, enacted a partial mitigation of it. But under Macrinus' successor, Elagabalus, the oppression became as intolerable nearly as under Caracalla. Then did the protesting voice of the law of equity, which had long been almost silenced, speak out again under the next reigning emperor, Alexander Severus, the only one for many years in those wretched times, whose character it was to do justice and love mercy, and he indeed did seek to mitigate the evil, above all by inculcating the spirit and the law of equity upon the administrators of the provincial government and of the revenue throughout the Roman world. But to reduce the tribute in any large amount, such as the case demanded, and such as some have supposed, was what I feel well assured he neither did nor could do. The grand sources of the expenses of government were lasting in their nature. The soldiery, the real masters of the empire, must at any cost be satisfied. Am I not he, was his own language to the mutinying troops of Antioch, who bestows on you the corn, the clothing, and the money of the provinces? His administration was an unavailing struggle against the corruption of the age, and for what he did, or showed that he wished to do, he paid the penalty of his life. After his murder, the evil soon became as oppressive as before. Through the reigns of Maximin and his successors, we trace it still running on, with disastrous influence on the body politic. In speaking of the empire's internal state under Philip, A.D. 248, a mere 13 or so years after the death of Alexander Severus, the following is Gibbon's descriptive sketch. Its form was still the same as under Hadrian and Augustus, but the animating vigor and health was fled. The industry of the people was discouraged and exhausted by a long series of oppression. And again, with reference to the calamitous times that followed soon after Philip's death, of which more under the next seal, that the long and general famine, which at that time befell the empire, was the inevitable consequence of rapine and oppression, which extirpated the produce of the present and the hope of future harvests. Nor did the evil stop then and there, but still continued onward to Gallienus's death, and even afterwards under the following emperors, those styled restorers of the Roman Empire, Claudius, Aurelian, Probus, until in fine Diocletian, conjunctive with his new imperatorial scheme, more fully developed and enforced this fiscal system, therewith perpetuating the oppression and consequent desolation of the provinces. Such is in brief the account handed down to us of the nature and aggravation of the evil under Caracalla, of A. Severus's vain attempts at applying an effective or permanent remedy, and of its perpetuation as a further cause of the decline of the empire. It is my conviction that we have here the very evil and witness of the law of equity, to its vain attempts at arresting it, figured in the vision under consideration. Hi, I'm Nicholas Arthur, and I'd like to introduce you to my latest book, Reformed Prophecy Interpretation, an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism in the 21st century. As with primitive biblical Christianity, historicism is the method of prophecy interpretation restored with the advent of the Protestant Reformation, and had become so widely held that for a long time it was called the Protestant view. My book is not so much about the errors of dispensationalism or amillennialism. Rather, it is about the historicist alternative to understanding many of the same passages from the vantage point of prophecy fulfilled in history, for those that desire more than mere hypotheses bolstered with conjectured speculation, those who require explicit biblical exegesis and verified historical fulfillment, and are not willing to accept speculation as anything other than what it is, speculation, not truth. This book is for you. Over the last century, this method of interpretation has become almost completely forgotten, even by Protestants, in the face of a method that is based almost entirely on future speculation, rather than fulfilled prophecy in history. In my book, I examine the reasons for this and investigate some of the prophecy which has been fulfilled in the interim, as well as present an apology for Reformed premillennial historicism to the 21st century. If you're interested in a copy of my book, you can go to my website, crosstheborder.org, and get more information there, or you may also find it at Amazon.